planet Earth. Much of it still a mystery today. But our story begins back before we began to keep track of time. The locale is an area in northern Alaska and Siberia. The people of this hostile land fight a constant battle for their lives. They came to terms with their environment, taking only what they needed as part of a balanced ecology, as the hunter defined man's relationship with nature. For all time, this relationship has been a matter of survival.
Our land was different then. We were all tundra people. Like now, we were hunters and fishermen, and we ranged across Siberia and northern Alaska.
This is Eskimo country, Seward's Folly. 400 million acres. Tundra, snow, ice. For this, Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of State paid $7,200,000 good American dollars in 1867 to the Russians. And the American people thought he was nuts. At the closest point today, Alaska is only 2 miles from Russian territory. This is the interface between the two most powerful nations in the world. At the time the Russians offered it to Seward, they had raped it for all it was worth. They left behind the ghosts of species they had hunted close to extinction, and a butchered people whose home this land had been for more than 8,000 years, the Eskimos. They were people who had survived and adapted to the cataclysmic end of the Ice Age, when much of their hunting land was reclaimed by the melting ice. They learned to restore the balance of their economy by taking to the sea in skin boats, to fish, and to hunt the great sea mammals that migrated through the Bering Straits, the bowhead whale and the walrus.
We grew close to the animals we hunted, and we honored our game both in song and dance, and we prospered and lived happily in the Arctic for thousands of years. We were Inuit, the people, man in the Arctic, and we came to be known to others as the Eskimo. We knew there were others, and we heard stories about them as we hunted and traded across our Arctic homeland from Siberia to Greenland. There were white men, it was said, and they sailed in large boats and hunted our game with rifles, and they slaughtered all they could find. First our sea otters, and then our fur seals, and then our bowhead whales, and then our walrus and Arctic seals, and then our fish.
But what Seward bought from the Russians back in 1867 was not the land itself, only the rights of sovereignty over it. And for this, they had little use for the time being, leaving it to the less than tender hands of the frontiersmen.
Many of our oldest families died of starvation or from new diseases like influenza, measles, smallpox, tuberculosis, and also from the booze. Like the bowhead whale and the other sea mammals, we were nearly wiped out by their commercial slaughter. until it finally stopped because there was so little of our game left that taking it from us was no longer profitable. We were left alone to die.
It is a reflection, perhaps, of the white man's schizoid nature that when his rapists break virgin territory, his religious missionaries are never far behind. After the American pioneers came inevitably the gamut of Christian faiths. The conscience of the white man began to extend the hand of friendship to the Eskimo. And although its effect was a culture shock in itself, its objective was the salvation rather than the destruction of the Eskimo people.
But we survived all right. The game was gone, so we moved in from our hunting and fishing camps to live together in larger villages where churches, schools, stores, and hospitals were open.
But this was survival on the white man's terms. The schools were more concerned with forgetting than with learning, forgetting the traditional Eskimo way of life, of hunting and fishing, and forgetting the language through which they expressed their culture. But the older generations resisted, and happily, the game was returning.
So slowly over the years, our hunting improved. Our communities were restored to health. We had many children, and once again we were able to live happily off our land. To supplement hunting, when game was scarce, we herded reindeer. And by the mid-30s, the few reindeer brought over from Siberia in the late 1800s had become over 600,000 in our herds throughout western Alaska. Point Hope, one of our oldest whaling villages, supplied good reindeer meat to communities south all the way to San Francisco and east into the Canadian Arctic. But we began to compete successfully against the beef industry. So the government closed us down by preventing us from slaughtering and shipping reindeer meat to market. Our reindeer joined the caribou herds, and today there are fewer than 50,000 reindeer in our herds.
It was another hard lesson for the Eskimos. But as they had adapted to the catastrophe of the Ice Age, so they were now beginning to adapt to living with the rapacity of the white man with whom they realized their future was now inextricably linked. But it was not until Alaska posed a real threat to the security of America itself that the federal government began to take the distant territory seriously. That threat came not from the peaceable Eskimos, but from the Japanese, who occupied key Aleutian Islands in World War II and built airstrips from which they intended to bomb the industrial heartland of America. So it was the defense of Chicago that brought many Americans to Alaska. And after the war, they wanted to stay. What had been the meat of survival to the natives was little more than quaint wildlife and picturesque scenery to the new arrivals. With 2 or 3 Americans gathered together, the inevitable request for democracy was soon to be heard, and statehood was eventually granted in January 1959. But statehood was a political structure devised by Americans for their own needs, and the new Constitution took little heed of the traditional economy of the natives. But now state government brought interference of the worst kind. The assertive self-interest of the new settlers showed neither understanding of nor respect for the Eskimo way of life. In addition, The privileges of American democracy are expensive. The new state had to be financed, and the federal government did this by a process which was flagrantly illegal. The new Constitution rode roughshod over the territorial rights of the Eskimos, and the deal allowed the state to appropriate 105 million acres which legally belonged to the native people of Alaska. Land auctions were held in the United States, and surveyors turned up in Alaska to push the Eskimo, the Indian, and the Aleut off tribal lands which had sustained their economy for thousands of years. And selection of this new state land was no arbitrary, random business. The sniff of mineral resources was in their nostrils, and their sights were set on the unimpeded exploitation of the oil deposits of Prudhoe Bay. Experience of coexistence with the white man had not only taught the Eskimos the facts of the acquisitive way of life, it had also toughened their skins. And with them, in the same boat now, were their neighbors, the Aleut and the Indian, whose lessons in the same school had been longer and harder. They began to work together, and took up the weapons with which the white man played his legalistic games. They fought hard in the federal courts of America, and in 1971, the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act passed through Congress. It established Alaska's native peoples as legal landlords of 40 million acres, just 10% of their inheritance. For the rest, they would receive $1 billion to be paid over a 20-year period with no trace of an index linked to inflation. About $3 an acre. Like other native peoples, the Eskimos quickly accommodated the material benefits of industrialization. Little boxes that can speak with many voices and sing. Great steel birds that can carry men in the sky. Webs of wire that hum with undreamed of power. These, with their intimations of divine authority, have beguiled mankind everywhere. But like others before them, the Eskimos discovered that such objects weakened traditional, cultural values and put nothing substantial in their place. But although the victory was Pyrrhic, the fact that the battle was fought at all was most significant to the Eskimos. They had acquired the self-confidence and skill with which to protect their way of life in the cruel context of a white man's world.
After they settled our land claims, we turned to organizing for strong local government. Our land claims were based upon our continuous use and occupancy of the entire Arctic for thousands of years. But now that they were settled, we knew we would need strong local government to ensure our continued use and occupancy of the Arctic. Well, the oil companies had built a good tax base on our land at Prudhoe Bay. So we organized the North Slope Borough to deal with the state and the feds and the oil corporations. The oil companies have fought against the borough, all right. They don't like to pay taxes to us, but they shouldn't feel that way. Our borough government is building an effective regional environmental protection program, while we also build new housing, schools, utility systems for the first time in the Arctic. We are using oil tax money to improve and protect life in the Arctic. Rather than always fighting us, the oil people should take pride in their investment in strong local government here in the Arctic. I wish the oil companies could live in peace with us while they are here. I mean, all we want is fair.
The North Slope Borough is the local government body covering 1/5 of the state of Alaska, the entire Arctic slope from Point Hope all the way to the Canadian border. It is the largest local government in the world. It controls a single regional ecological system in which for 8,000 years the Eskimos have been numerically the dominant human element. Now Eskimos themselves are dominant in the borough. They have adapted to the ways of American democracy and are beginning once again in this new way to control their environment in the interests of their own culture. They have a better understanding of that environment than anyone else, but they find themselves pressured between two powerful external forces, commercial and conservationist. In protecting the future, the Borough Eskimos are not motivated by sentimental nostalgia for a past way of life. They see theirs as a growing culture, one to which a carefully controlled exploitation of oil resources can make an invaluable economic contribution. But they know that in 50 years, both the oil and the oil men will be gone. And they will depend once more for their livelihood on their traditional skills of hunting and fishing. Preservation of the delicate ecological balance may put the oil companies to a little extra expense now, but on it depends the Eskimos' future survival. It is the Eskimo himself who is now fighting any technological development that threatens to upset that balance. For instance, while they did not oppose the Trans-Alaska Oil Pipeline, they do oppose opening the Fairbanks-Prudhoe Construction Haul Road for public use. Regular traffic on that road would cause irreparable damage to the migration of the caribou, upon which so many Eskimo people depend. Instead, they want the oil men to fly in as much of their equipment as possible. The borough is fighting for a coastal zone management program for the entire North American Arctic coast. The oil and gas industry also threatens the great bowhead whale, which the Eskimos still hunt in their skin boats. They're concerned that the whaling controversy should be resolved on the basis of fact rather than emotion. And this was one of the main objectives for the first Inuit Circumpolar Conference, which was hosted by the borough. Alongside the mechanized vandalism of the Russian and Japanese whalers, the Eskimos' use of the bowhead, in which they leave no waste at all, is a piece of ecological perfection.
The Battle of the Bowhead brought us close together with our own people and our friends across the United States and around the world. Our battle to retain a life-giving right was upheld by their support. But the battle to remain custodian over the caribou, the birds, the sea mammals, still continues. Misunderstandings by people living in distant cities continue to hurt our way of life and threaten our survival. Well-meaning people take up causes there, not knowing anything about us or our land and seas here. To most people, the Northland, the Arctic, looks like this. But to us Eskimo, the world is seen in a different way. We do not look north, but south. Our ancient villages, which exist today, are oriented toward the migrating sea mammals coming from the warmer places. But our concern extends throughout the entire Arctic, not just Alaska.
Neither bowhead nor caribou stop to produce passports at international frontiers. They are the moving parts of the Arctic ecological system, which touches the territory of 5 nations: the United States, Canada, Greenland, Denmark, Norway, and the USSR. The Eskimos of Alaska have assumed a deep responsibility for the whole system, and through their own newfound political voice, they seek to prompt the United States government to take an international lead in the vital defense of the area's ecology. They want some of the vast wealth that oil exploitation is creating to serve their long-term future. The cards of history were mostly stacked against them, but they are a marvelously optimistic people. Cards they hold are probably a lot less powerful than they imagine, but at least they are now doing some of the dealing.
We'll work this all out with the oil industry, all right. Our strength comes from a strong national feeling for our Arctic homeland. Nobody wants it to come to harm. And time is on our side, you know. Our leaders are young. Our children are getting good schooling. We are becoming better hunters, better able to watch over our land. We aren't up here alone any longer either. We have modern communications now. We can tell the world when things go wrong here. And the world listens to us. And they believe us out there because they know that we know what we are talking about up here. We are going to survive all right. Better than that, we are going to prosper.
Someday in the not-too-distant future, all the oil and gas and coal will have been drawn from the North Slope and shipped south to the energy-depleted communities. But left behind will be the original conquerors of this land, the Inuit, the Eskimo. And all this time will have been only a moment in their long history. And their hope is that they will have benefited by this moment so that they can continue to exist here, living by the enduring values of their ancestors and harvesting the land and waterways. For this is the only way they will be able to survive in a land that no one else ever called home. Their struggle today is a matter of survival for all of us throughout the world.